Dan McClellan is one of the most followed Bible scholars on social media. And if you've watched him long enough, you've noticed something. He loves his phrase, the overwhelming majority of scholars agree. Now, I'm not a scholar, and I certainly have never had the amount of student debt Dan has. But I am a guy who reads scholarly books, and they're popularizers. I've studied the Bible my whole life now, almost 40 years, and I try to think carefully about what the evidence actually shows. But that phrase has always bothered me because it gets repeated so confidently and so often that it starts to feel less like a description of scholarship and more like a rhetorical move. So I decided to test it out. I pulled 5 specific claims from Dan's video, Why You Can't Trust the Bible. 5 times he invoked the overwhelming majority clause, and I ran them through AI with one simple instruction. Don't narrow the field. Include conservative scholarship. Include everyone with credentials. First, here are the 5 claims. Is Dan right? Did he accurately represent the overwhelming majority of scholars? Or does his claim only work by narrowing who gets to count in the discussion? Let's take a look.
How many people do you think wrote the Bible?
A lot, like more than 12.
It was actually over 40.
Actually, it's more like well over 100, and then a lot more editors and redactors and scribes responsible for the form of the text as it has come down to us. But this apologetic notion that there were somewhere between 40 and 45 authors responsible for the entire Bible is just a dogma. So, for instance, the notion that David wrote the Psalms, that Solomon wrote Proverbs, that Moses wrote the Pentateuch, these are all dogmas, traditional ascriptions of authorship that are not supported by the data and are rejected by the overwhelming majority of scholars.
Dan's first claim. The overwhelming majority of scholars denied that there were 40 to 45 human authors of the Bible. And on top of that, he says the real number is well over 100. So I asked AI, is that accurate? Does the overwhelming majority of scholars actually reject the 40 to 45 range? Here's what it came back with. The critical scholars, the ones Dan typically references, yes, they push the number higher. That part is fair. But here's where it gets interesting. Conservative scholars, credentialed, published, academically serious, they largely affirm the traditional authorship attributions. And traditional authorship lands you right back near that 40 to 45 range. So the overwhelming majority claim only holds if you're already decided that conservative scholars don't count. Now, on the well over 100, AI flagged this as well. There's no settled number, even within critical scholarship. The documentary hypothesis, redaction criticism, and supplementary models all multiply sources but disagree significantly on how many hands were involved. And here's what's interesting. Even at the most conservative end of critical scholarship, the numbers overlap uncomfortably close to the 40 to 45 range. Well over 100 is toward the high end of what critical scholars propose, not the consensus middle. So, Dan isn't reporting a majority position, he's presenting the high end of a disputed range as if it's settled fact. Verdict? This is misleading.
Well, do you know how long it took to write the Bible?
Yeah, it was written over a course of like 300 years from the time of Jesus' death up until like Nicaea.
Well, you're thinking of the New Testament, which was written fully within 70 years of Jesus' death and resurrection.
This is another dogma that's not supported by the data that presupposes every word of the text is true. The overwhelming majority of scholars agree that there are parts of the New Testament that were not written until the 2nd century CE, which is over 70 years after Jesus' death.
Dan's second claim. The overwhelming majority of scholars agreed that parts of the New Testament were written well into the 2nd century. So I asked AI, is that the majority position? Here's what it came back with. Even among critical scholars, Dan's own camp, the majority position dates the entire New Testament canon as completed by around 100 AD. That's not a conservative talking point, that's the critical mainstream. Now, the books of the canon that get pushed latest are the pastoral epistles, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. Critical scholars do debate those, but even the most aggressive critical dating for those books lands them at early 2nd century at most, not well into the 2nd century. And conservative scholars like Carson, Guthrie, Moo have produced serious peer-reviewed academic work defending 1st century dates for every single book in the canon. These aren't popular level apologists. These are credentialed scholars engaging the same evidence. Now, shameless plug, we did do a series on the Pauline authorship as an introductory discussion. You can find that in our critical scholarship playlist. So, well into the 2nd century overstates even what the critical mainstream actually claims. Dan pushed past his own camp's majority position. The verdict? His stance doesn't hold up.
Well, the Old Testament was completed over 400 years before Jesus came.
Also entirely false, because most scholars agree the book of Daniel wasn't completed until somewhere around the middle of the 2nd century BCE, probably 150 years before Jesus was born, or maybe a little less than that.
Dan's third claim. Most scholars agree the book of Daniel was not completed until the middle of the 2nd century BC. So I asked AI, is that the overwhelming majority? Here's what it came back with. The approximately 165 BC dating for Daniel is the critical mainstream position. That part is fair. Critical scholars tie that date to the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes and the Maccabean crisis. Their argument is that Daniel's prophecies track history accurately right up to that 165 BC, and then they go vague, which they say means it was written then, not centuries earlier. But here's the problem. Scholars like Gleason Archer, Kenneth Kitchen, and Andrew Steinman, credentialed, published, academically serious, have produced substantial challenges to that late dating. This is not fringe scholarship, this is real academic debate. And there's something else worth noting. Ezekiel chapter 14 references Job, Noah, and Daniel together as ancient figures of righteousness. If Daniel was written in 165 BC, that reference becomes very difficult to explain. That's an internal biblical argument that late dating advocates have to work around. But here's the deeper issue that doesn't get stated out loud enough. The entire late dating argument rests on the prior assumption that the Bible cannot predict a future. So yes, late dating is the critical mainstream, but overwhelming majority only works if you've already decided conservative scholars don't get a vote. And the reason conservative scholars land differently isn't because they're ignoring the evidence, it's because they're starting from different theological assumptions about what the text is allowed to do. That is the same move we saw in Claim 1, and we are for sure going to keep seeing it. The verdict? Misleading.
See, that's an insane amount of time. And why is it dating between 1500 and 2000? Why is that so broad for 500 years?
Well, because various Bible scholars, they will date the book of Job to be around 2000 BC. But then there's some people who traditionally date the book to be around 1500, 1300, something that's less old.
That's absolutely asinine. I don't know who this content creator has in mind, but they're not Bible scholars. The majority of Bible scholars think that the book of Job was probably written in the Persian period. Now, it might preserve some earlier narratives from maybe a couple of centuries earlier, but there are no Bible scholars who think it was written prior to the existence of the Hebrew and the Aramaic language.
Dan's fourth claim, the book of Job could not have been written between 1500 and 2000 BC. He calls that dating asinine and laughably wrong. His argument is that Hebrew and Aramaic didn't exist that far back, so the text couldn't have been written then. So I asked AI, is that the overwhelming majority, or is something else going on here? Here's what Claude came back with. The Persian period dating is the critical mainstream. That part is fair. But the language argument Dan is leaning on, that Hebrew and Aramaic didn't exist at 1500 to 2000 BC, is what scholars call an argument from silence. We don't have extensive written Hebrew samples from that period, but the reason we don't have them is not proof the language didn't exist. Writing in that era was done on perishable materials, papyrus, animal skins, wood. Almost none of it survived 3,500 years. Absence of surviving text is not the same thing as absence of the language. And conservative scholars like Archer and Walton and others have engaged the dating of Job seriously and academically. A patriarchal or early dating is not a fringe position. It is a credentialed academic position that operates within a coherent framework. Dan dismisses Taco's dating as laughably wrong and beneath serious engagement. But the argument from silence he's relying on is not as airtight as he's presenting it. The verdict? Dan's being misleading.
So that's why there's that distinction between the two, even though like the Mesopotamian documents that we have as like an extra biblical documentation regarding Job, those are from around 2000 BC.
There are no Mesopotamian documents that are considered to be any kind of extra biblical anything related to Job.
Dan's fifth claim. There are no Mesopotamian documents considered to be of any kind of extra biblical reference to Job. So I asked AI, is Dan right to be that dismissive? Here's what came back. The documents are real. The Sumerian Job dates to approximately 2000 to 1700 BC. There are also other Babylonian documents like the Babylonian Job, and they date to around 1000 to 1300 BC. The Babylonian theodicy features a sufferer and friends debating divine justice, structured almost identical to the book of Job. These are not obscure texts. These are discussed in mainstream academic Job commentaries by serious scholars. Now, to be fair to Dan, he may be making the more nuanced argument that mainstream scholarship doesn't treat these as direct literary sources for Job. That is a defensible position, but that is not what he said. He said there are none.
There are no Mesopotamian documents that are considered to be any kind of extra-biblical anything related to Job.
And that flat dismissal is not what the academic literature supports. Here is what makes this the perfect way to close out these 5 claims. Dan accused Taco of not providing data, but Taco was pointing to real documents that real scholars engage seriously with. Dan dismissed it with one sentence and moved on. No engagement, no data, just confidence. And that is the pattern we have seen across all 5 claims. So there it is, 5 claims. 5 times Dan invoked the overwhelming majority of scholars statement. Now I'm trying to be honest, I'm not the scholar here. There are areas where I'm more well-versed and have noticed this pattern from Dan, but these 5 claims touched on areas I needed help with. So I used AI. Maybe AI is completely wrong on all of it. I find that unlikely. Maybe the scholars it cited are wrong. That's possible too. But here's the real point. Dan reacts to Taco's video as though Taco's claims are laughable, simple, obvious, like anyone paying attention should be able to see right through them. But these 5 claims don't look that settled when you actually check. They look like live debates with serious scholars on multiple sides. And here's what I find very interesting. Dan actually accuses Taco of not providing data. But watch that video. Dan doesn't provide data either. He makes claims and expects you to trust his knowledge of the scholarship. No citations, no engagement with alternative views, just the overwhelming majority of scholars say. I recently heard someone describe how scholarship is actually supposed to work. You state all the views, or all the legitimate views, then you engage them. That's it. That's the standard. Dan is welcome to come back and refute every conservative scholar AI cited. He's welcome to engage the alternative views and explain why they don't hold up. That would actually be a great video to watch. But dismissing Taco's claims as though they're beneath serious engagement while providing zero data yourself, that's not scholarship. That's authority by assertion. Claude AI gave me enough reason to question the methodology, and that's really all I was trying to do. Well, I hope this helped. And until next time, stay shaped by reason, guided by faith, and grounded in Christ. Take it easy.